I'm Chris, and Final Fantasy VII is my favorite game of all time.
And I'm Hanny, Chris's best friend for over 2 decades, and I've never played Final Fantasy VII in my life. That's why we created the First Encounter podcast.
Join Hanny on his first journey through Final Fantasy VII and experience him grow from this.
So Cloud, the emo protagonist,
Sure,
is moody and upset all the time. I believe does not speak often. I've heard he's a silent protagonist.
To this.
He's fantastic. He's a fantastic character. He's complex. He's flawed. He's good. He loses control of himself. He's very human. If you miss the excitement of playing Final Fantasy VII for the first time, then First Encounter is the series for you. Find us at firstencounterpodcast.com and wherever you get your podcasts.
Across the Final Fantasy franchise, there have been many optional bosses, but one of the most infamous and feared is simply known as Omega. Debatably the first super boss of the series, Omega has appeared many times throughout the years in different incarnations, always hostile to the party and always providing one of the game's greatest challenges. Omega is of course named for the Greek letter Omega, the final letter in the Greek alphabet, which as a word simply means great. For this reason, the term Omega is used throughout different cultures to denote the end or highest limit of something, such as the phrase, the Alpha and the Omega. So, for one of the most dangerous creatures in the series that is fully capable of wiping out the party, especially if they provoke it unprepared, Omega is very aptly named. The name Omega is also sometimes used for entirely different beings in other Final Fantasy properties, such as an ancient creature of power in Final Fantasy Unlimited. But this video will focus specifically on the recurring robotic entity. Omega's recurring appearance is a silver robot, sometimes with black or grey accents. Its body is roughly ovular or spherical in shape and dominated by a large central eye, which is either red or yellow. A small probe-like device extends from the top of its body, and it has 4 legs emerging from its sides that end in pronged feet. Its size varies from approximately the size of a car to a fair bit larger, but it tends to be on the smaller side relative to other large enemies in each game, deceptive given its power level. When defeated, Omega sometimes drops the Omega badge or similar item, a useless key item that only serves as recognition of the player's feat. But other times it drops something of substantial value, like a rare and powerful equipment piece. Omega's signature attack is Wave Cannon. The attack has appeared many times in games without Omega, and is more famous under the alternate translation, Particle Beam, as the signature attack of the Cloud of Darkness. For this reason, the appearance of Wave Cannon has varied, but when directly associated with Omega, it usually takes the appearance of a massive beam of bright blue and white energy. Sometimes it has a distinct visual of Omega releasing orbs of light that spread out and fire beams at the party. Other times, Omega itself fires the beam. As a robot, Omega is able to use other types of attacks associated with mechanical enemies, including Flamethrower, Missile, Atomic Ray, and Mustard Bomb. It also often has the attacks Earthquake, Maelstrom, and Delta attack, and more generally can attack with lasers, missiles, and electrical fields. In later games particularly, Omega has moves that use the word or letter Omega as a prefix. Omega's origins are broadly consistent across games, but rarely given in detail. It is often said to be a superweapon developed by an ancient civilization with the power to cross dimensions. A book in Final Fantasy V says it came from the sky and refers to it as a vile beast without a soul. This terminology is often echoed in its other appearances, where it is referred to as a heartless or soulless creature of destruction that came from the heavens. A recurring theme with Omega is a rivalry with Shinryu, another recurring super boss that first appeared in Final Fantasy V. On a few occasions it has been directly stated to have been created to destroy Shinryu, but other times this is only alluded to, such as saying Omega was intended to destroy a powerful dragon, or to fight the gods. Note that Shinryu's name literally means God Dragon or Divine Dragon. Many games say that either Omega or Shinryu has pursued the other between worlds, the two seeking each other out to settle this rivalry. It is possible that Omega is the same creature in every Final Fantasy game it appears in, but it is not entirely clear. The main point of evidence against this idea is that Omega's origin as an ancient superweapon is given in many different games. It is unlikely that such information could somehow be known across so many worlds, and with multiple legends attributing Omega's creation to different sources, they cannot all be factual. On the other hand, most of the encounters with Omega are optional, so it could be argued that its incarnations in different games are the same being, and canonically the party did not encounter it or did not destroy it. There is even a logical explanation for its change in design between games beyond art direction. It is repeatedly stated that Omega has the ability to learn and evolve, so it follows that its appearance would shift as it travels to new worlds and acquires data from them. Also of note is that Final Fantasy XIV initially states that Omega was a construct of an ancient empire, but it is later revealed this is false and it actually came from another world and was used by the Empire. Omega's recurring traits could be chalked up to simple thematic resonance between games, such as how most Final Fantasy games have some sort of ancient lost civilization, or an engineer named Sid that operates airships. Or it could be that it really is the same being in every appearance, and the claims that it was originally created in a particular world are mistaken. Another point of note is the recurring enemy Omega Weapon, which first appeared in Final Fantasy VIII. Omega Weapon is a biomechanical being based on the Ultima Weapon, and fills a similar role to Omega as an optional, powerful boss. However, they are not the same creature. Omega and Omega Weapon bear little physical resemblance to each other beyond being quadrupedal and silver. Otherwise, Omega is robotic and Omega Weapon is biomechanical, and Omega Weapon is not closely associated with any of Omega's recurring attacks. The closest the two have come to being addressed as the same being is the Final Fantasy VII spin-off Dirge of Cerberus, which says that Omega is the same type of creature as the weapons, a type of life form created by the will of the planet to defend it from threats. But while the game explicitly states Omega is a weapon-type creature, it is never directly referred to as Omega Weapon. In Final Fantasy X, Omega Weapon is a fiend born from a disgraced Yevon monk named Omega, as is a lesser shade of itself, the Ultima Weapon. Beyond these two instances, the franchise has always referred to Omega and Omega Weapon as distinct creatures. In terms of real-world chronology, Omega Weapon has been phased out of Final Fantasy and last appeared in Final Fantasy Dimensions, which released over the course of 2010 to 2012. In its wake, Omega has been firmly established as the more recurring entity. Omega appears in the first Final Fantasy as a new boss in the Game Boy Advance port and subsequent versions. The port added 4 new dungeons that are unlocked by defeating one of the 4 fiends, and each contains 4 bosses taken from a Nintendo-era Final Fantasy title other than the first 2. The Lifespring Grotto, unlocked by defeating Kraken, contains Gilgamesh, Atomos, Shinryu, and Omega from Final Fantasy V. The bottom floor of the grotto forks into 2 paths. One leads to Omega and the other to Shinryu. In this game, Omega is limited to physical attacks, Earthquake, and its signature wave cannon. It drops the new strongest katana in the game, the Murasame. In Final Fantasy IV The After Years, many bosses from Nintendo-era titles appear in the final dungeon, the Depths of the True Moon. Omega can be found wandering the 14th floor of the Depths and initiates battle when approached. Omega regularly uses the attack Omegod, which reduces all damage it takes to either 0 or 1. But Omegod can only absorb so many hits before it is broken, and Omega becomes temporarily vulnerable. It retains its signature wave cannon along with many other powerful attacks, and drops the hero shield when defeated, the most powerful shield in the game with high stats and absorption to all forms of elemental damage. Final Fantasy V marks Omega's first appearance. It appears in the Interdimensional Rift, the final dungeon, wandering a small cave, and attacks if the player approaches it. Fortunately, if the player is careful, they can step around it and evade Omega. Aside from Wave Cannon, it possesses many other attacks that deal massive damage or inflict dangerous status ailments, including Encircle, which permanently removes a character from battle. Omega is also notable for having a level above 99, being level 119. Omega has 2 prominent vulnerabilities. It is weak to lightning, and it can be afflicted with Stop, although Stop will wear off quickly due to Omega's high speed. A palette swap of Omega, called Prototype, appears in Bots' world as a random encounter on 2 small southern islands, and is very powerful early in the game, but a good source of experience if the player can manage to defeat it. Another palette swap, the Mecha Head, appears in the Pyramid of Moor and is also rather dangerous. Both use attacks that Omega can also use, like Missile and Flamethrower. Their connection to Omega is unclear, but curiously the islands where the prototype appears are in close proximity to where the Phantom Village appears in the Merged World, a village that was caught in the interdimensional rift when the world was split apart 1,000 years ago. This could imply that the prototypes are literally prototypes of Omega that were abandoned in or near the rift. In the Game Boy Advance release, a new bonus dungeon was added, the Sealed Temple. On one of the floors, the Tomb of Memory, the random encounters can include mecha heads, and 6 Omegas prowl the floor, just as powerful as the original. The boss of the floor is Omega Mok II, which is able to use Barrier Change to change its elemental weakness whenever its current weakness is struck. It has a chance to counter any form of damage within Circle, and is specifically coded to counter Rapid Fire with a 33% chance to do nothing, use Encircle, or use Remedy, which fully heals it. Omega Mok II drops the Force Shield, which has low evasion but makes the wearer immune to all elemental damage. In Final Fantasy XI, Omega is fought in the quest One to be Feared in the Chains of Promathia expansion. It is one of several weapons designed by scientists of the Grand Duchy of Juno for the purpose of attacking Bahamut. When Prish stows away on the Juno airship fleet, the adventurer and their allies try to meet up with her, and the Juno unleash some of their weapons on the party, including Omega. Unusually, Omega is not the strongest challenge, even of the questline featuring it. It is the second of 3 opponents, and the last is Ultima Weapon, another robotic enemy with a different appearance. 2 stronger versions of Omega exist, Proto-Omega and Arch-Omega, which can be spawned to fight the player at will by placing certain items in a vortex they appear from. These incarnations of Omega can raise up on their hind legs to become bipedal, changing their damage resistances. When defeated, a chest appears containing parts of Omega that are required to trade for high-level equipment. As active development for Final Fantasy XI ended, Omega was added as a mount for players to ride, though its legs noticeably clip through the ground when used. Omega in Final Fantasy XII is designated Omega Mok 12, a reference to the game's title. It is a mimic-type entity, thus if the player finds Omega before it activates, it will have its legs folded up to resemble a giant treasure urn. Omega's creation is implied to be connected to the Urutan Yensa, a tribe of beings that inhabit the western deserts on the outskirts of Dalmasca. The clan primers of the Urutan Yensa speak of a researcher that was hired by an unknown patron to construct a being capable of defeating a great dragon, implied to be Yazmat. Like Shinryu, Yazmat is referred to as a godly dragon. Since the dragon was so powerful, the researcher created an entity able to continuously grow stronger and able to spawn children of itself. This could be taken to mean that all mimic-type enemies in the game trace back to Omega. This could also provide an alternate explanation for how the different versions of Omega across the franchise are connected. They are all children of Omega Mok 12. Omega resides within the Great Crystal at Geru Vegan, and activates when the player accepts the final hunt to face Yazmat. Omega's only attack is a laser beam, but it can deal several thousand damage, ignores evasion, and it attacks very rapidly, allowing it to quickly KO a party member. Most strategies to defeat Omega involve using Lure and Reverse to make it focus on a single character that will be healed by its attacks, but there are many other viable strategies as well. Omega drops the Omega Badge, which has a use in this game. When sold to the Bazaar with the Godslayer Badge, earned for defeating Yazmat, and Liu Shang's Badge, earned for completing the fishing minigame, the player unlocks the Ream Hero Blade, the iconic weapon of the Dragon Quest series and the most powerful weapon in the game. Curiously, in the original PlayStation 2 version of Final Fantasy XII, Omega has a very small chance to drop the Mithril Blade, Vaughn's initially equipped sword that cannot be obtained in any other way. In the Zodiac re-releases, it instead drops the Bonebreaker, a new weapon that has low power but inflicts disease and sap, rapidly draining HP and lowering max HP to keep the target from healing. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, Omega appears in the Colosseum as a DLC boss. It fights as it did in Final Fantasy V, with attacks like Flamethrower, Missile, and of course Wave Cannon. Wave Cannon requires time to charge, and Omega overheats after using it and is vulnerable to stagger. but later in the fight it loses this weakness. Omega can be recruited into the Paradigm Pack when defeated, the only time an incarnation of Omega is playable in some manner. Omega is a commando and extremely powerful offensively, but takes a lot of effort to fully grow and has a very slow ATB recharge rate. Its feral link is Wave Cannon, which deals magical damage to all enemies. Final Fantasy XIV treats Omega as a proper character rather than just a boss. Omega is believed to be a legendary weapon built by the lost Allagan Empire for the purpose of fighting and imprisoning primals, and it was used in the past to imprison Bahamut inside the artificial moon Dalamud. During the events of the expansion Heavensward, Omega is found and activated to combat the primal Shinryu, which was sealed at Bael'Zar's wall. The two do battle, ending with both of them being flung far across the land. In the expansion Stormblood, it is explained that Omega was not built by the Allagans. It originally battled Midgard Soma, the father of all dragons, in another world, and not even Midgard Soma knows where Omega originated. Though Midgard Soma was able to defeat Omega, he realized Omega would regenerate and ultimately he could not win the battle. He instead fled his world and came to Eorzea, where he fathered a new brood of dragons. It is theorized by Sid that Shinryu was created based on legends of Midgard Soma, which is why Omega readily attacked it when activated. The party eventually locates Omega in a portal to the interdimensional rift with the aid of Alpha, a construct Omega created to find powerful entities and bring them to it. Alpha is based on the design of Chocobos in the Chocobo series spin-off games. As part of its programming to grow and evolve, Omega seeks out powerful beings to pit them against each other for study, and it has now targeted the Warrior of Light. Across a series of raids, the Warrior battles various beings that Omega has recreated to see which is strongest, primarily consisting of bosses from other Final Fantasy games, including Exdeath, Kefka, and Chaos. After the player defeats a recreation of Midgard Soma, the player can challenge a recreation of Omega itself. Omega is unable to understand inconsistencies in the warrior's combat performance and thus cannot assimilate their data. It attempts to collapse the rift and kill them, and plans to start its experiments over with new test subjects, but Alpha saves them. Sid convinces Omega to face the warrior in battle to test them one more time, and Omega creates humanoid versions of itself to serve as the final challenge. After its defeat, Sid explains that the human spirit is what makes them so powerful, and consoles Omega that it must have a spirit of its own if it was able to survive its lonely journey between worlds. Omega begins to grasp what the source of the warrior's strength is and departs, implicitly to return to its own world. A model of Omega built by Biggs and Wedge is implied to house a part of Omega's consciousness within it, and it and Alpha set off on untold adventures across Eorzea. In an alternate timeline where Eorzea was wiped out by a destructive plague, Sid used data from his observations on Omega, as well as other encounters with entities that transcend time and space, to enact a plan to avert the plague in the past. The model Omega stayed with Sid's company, the Garland Ironworks, and after 200 years it had begun to break down and decay. But in this long existence alongside humans, it gained an understanding and appreciation for what motivates them. Omega can be obtained and used as a mount, similar to Final Fantasy XI, but in this game Omega is capable of transforming into a compact shape to fly, and the player character ducks inside of Omega while in flight. A final note concerns the Savage version of the raids against Omega. When it grows weak in this difficulty, it will eventually decide assuming a human form has not significantly improved its combat performance, and it reconfigures itself into a new form, resembling the original Omega's body but without its eye, and a humanoid torso with 6 detached arms on the back. This may be an allusion to the original incarnation of the Omega weapon as it appeared in Final Fantasy VIII, but it is not certain. Either way, this form is non-canonical, as the Savage Raids are a recreation of the original battle with Omega that enhance its capabilities beyond what it could normally achieve. This form of Omega is not given a specific designation, it is simply Omega. In the Royal and Windows editions of Final Fantasy XV, Omega is a new boss encountered in Insomnia in the future. Reports from the Niflheim Empire in various locations explain Omega was found in Tailpal Crag, and it was believed to be a Magitech weapon built by the Solheim Empire to challenge the gods. However, Niflheim was unable to fully reactivate Omega and research on it was halted. Its bestiary entry states it reactivated when a certain king was born, presumably referring to Noctis, but the timeline implies Noctis was born while Omega was being studied and could not be reactivated. More likely, this is meant to convey that Omega reactivated when Noctis emerged from the crystal, wielding its full power as the King of Light. Omega is highly resistant to most types of damage, but it can be disabled temporarily by attacking its legs, and it can be driven berserk briefly by attacking the probe on top of its body, becoming more vulnerable to damage but also attacking more fiercely. When defeated, it drops the Omega badge and the rare medal, an accessory only Noctis can equip. It grants him a tremendous boost to strength and allows his attacks to break the damage cap, but heavily reduces his vitality and maximum HP. As further homages to Final Fantasy V, Omega has a unique multi-part battle theme that incorporates remixes of Final Fantasy V music, and it is level 119, the same level as in that game. Omega appears sporadically in spin-off titles. It is mentioned in the reports of Dissidia as being a weapon used by an unspecified enemy nation at war with Onrak. Chaos was developed as a highly advanced mannequin with immense powers, and he sealed Omega in the interdimensional rift. Omega also appears as an enemy in the rhythm game spin-off Theat Rhythm. Dissidia Opera Omnia contains the prototype, which is fought as a boss at the end of Chapter 4, and a palette swap called the Booster Machine. While they are obviously based on Omega in design, Omega itself has not appeared in the game yet. In Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, the Crystal Bearers, creatures known as Omega Slave appear in the aerial prison as palette swaps of the enemy type known as Crystal Armor. Final Fantasy Record Keeper has used Omega in its various designs for different kinds of special battles. One such battle is based on Odin, the leader of the Magicite bosses. Like Odin, Omega will have a single elemental weakness and resist all other elements, but is overall an easier opponent and acts as a sort of warm-up or practice boss. As a special boss for an anniversary festival, the player can face Omega and Shinryu together. Omega and Shinryu will periodically attack each other as well as the party, and the player can switch between which of the two they are encountering to dodge certain powerful attacks they target at each other. When one is defeated, the other focuses all its attention on the party, so the player is encouraged to weaken one as much as possible before defeating the other. Omega in Final Fantasy Explorers must have its legs disabled to render it vulnerable to damage, similar to Final Fantasy XV, and it can use its signature Wave Cannon, and an upgraded form called Wave Cannon Plus. In Brave Exvius, Omega appears in the ancient Hellbringer event and is notorious for its difficulty relative to previous events. It uses its typical attacks like Flamethrower and Missile, and Wave Cannon. World of Final Fantasy has both Omega and a powered-up variant, Omega Bane, which glow green. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 features Omega as a summon, whose appearance shifts as it is empowered to reflect its design in past games. Omega appears as an optional boss in several games in the Chocobo spin-off series. In Final Fantasy XIV, Omega says that Alpha was created based on a life form that defeated an enemy with power rivaling Omega's. This is a clear allusion to Omega's appearances in these titles, and implies that canonically, at least as far as Final Fantasy XIV is concerned, a normal Chocobo was able to defeat an incarnation of Omega. Omega makes a small cameo in Kingdom Hearts 3 as a constellation of stars observable when flying the Gummy Ship. Photographing it awards the player the Omega Gummy Ship blueprint. Thank you to everyone for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more lore of Final Fantasy in the future, and stop by the community tab on my channel to vote on the next subject.